For 250 years, Spain controlled much of the world's trade routes. This included the Pacific trade routes that connected Asia to the Americas. What the Spanish did not realize at the time was how much their trade would affect the makeup of people who now call the New World home. These trade routes were the beginnings of true global trade. Although the Spaniards were involved in trade through countries such as Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama, their bread and butter, so to speak, was from a trade route known as the Manila Galleon. This was a trade route that connected Asia to the New World and Europe, using the Philippines and Mexico as their connection points. This trade route lasted for 250 years from 1565 to 1815, using ships known as galleons to transport commodities back and forth between the two hemispheres. Galleons were massive ships that flew the Spanish flag and had Spanish commanders, but were in reality built in the Philippines by natives and manned mostly by seamen from the islands. It should be noted here that what we call Filipinos now and what were known as Filipinos during this time are two different things. Today, we consider a Filipino somebody native to the Philippine Islands. During the days of the Manila Galleon Trade, there were three types of people found in the Philippines: Spaniards, who were from Spain; Filipinos, who were Spanish yet born in the Philippines; and Indios, who were native born and of the Philippine culture. Since the ships were built and sailed from the Luzon region, most of the Indios were known as Indios Luzones. And while the Galleons sailed under a Spanish flag, most of their success came from their Indios subordinates. For the Spanish, the Indios were today's equivalent of cheap labor. It should be noted the contribution these Indios from the Philippines made toward the prominence of Spain during these 250 years. They built the galleons even though the flags and commanders were Spanish, and they also manned the ships. Research has revealed that 4 out of every 5 crew members were in fact Indios. They were also skilled navigators and seamen. Although Spain claimed the credit, the Indios were mostly responsible for defeating the Dutch in war. And it was the Indios who helped make Spain prosper through its Pacific trade routes. The Indios helped connect trade between China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the New World, including indirect trade to Europe through their Acapulco connection. In fact, this trade route eclipsed even the Atlantic trade between Spain and the New World. Every year, at least 4 ships traveled from Manila to Acapulco with armed escorts following. The trip took 4 months and was considered treacherous for even the most seasoned traveler. For this reason, the ships tended to stay near the shore whenever possible. The galleons often sailed to Canada and then down the west coast to Acapulco in Mexico. Besides the hazards of the Pacific, food often went bad. Passengers starved, and many died before ever seeing land. As a result, many voyagers often elected to stay in the New World rather than attempt a trip home. They also had to deal with navies, privateers, and even pirates. And these ships carried more than Indios seamen and Spanish leaders. There were many strong Indios young men, but also younger women, who were either servants or concubines. Even though Spain legislated that concubines and female servants were not to travel with the galleons, virtually nobody paid attention to the law. As a result, a lot of these women arrived in Acapulco pregnant. A third group of passengers were chieftains and tribal leaders from India's population. These were leaders who often angered Spanish officials, so they sent them on the galleons to separate them from the people underneath them. This was a form of exile. In the end, this trade exposed the potential of the Philippines to the rest of the world and made many natives of the islands hungry for independence. Their trade introduced foods and commodities to Mexico, and likewise from Mexico to the Philippines. So how did this trade change the cultural and racial heritage of people who live in Mexico and the United States. As I mentioned earlier, the journey was treacherous. By the time the Galleons reached Acapulco, many people were relieved to finally end their passage. On one journey alone, 74 Indios jumped ship in Acapulco and blended with the native population to avoid having to do a return trip. But Mexico was not only the destination for Spanish wanting to expand their influence in the Americas. California was viewed as the northern frontier, and it was a matter of time before the United States West Coast became a part of that vision. And that vision became a reality on October 18th, 1587, when a Spanish galleon arrived in Morro Bay, California. Spanish leaders wanted to explore the area and make contact with the native tribes. Thinking the brown skin of the Indios Lozonas would make contact easier with the locals, they sent 2 Indios armed with shields and swords to explore the vicinity. After a few days, they did establish contact, and the plan worked briefly. Unfortunately, once their European counterparts arrived, some misunderstandings arose and the negotiations took a violent turn. 2 men for the expedition were killed almost instantly. One was an Indio who took a javelin to the chest. The other was a Spaniard who was killed shortly afterward. The expedition retreated, and years later, the Spanish returned to colonize California and establish missions. Many Indios contributed to these efforts as well. As a result, Mexico and the United States have substantial populations of Filipino heritage. As of 2018, there were 4.1 million Philippine descendants living in the United States, most in California. In fact, many Americans would probably be surprised to learn that the first permanent Philippine settlement in our nation was established near present-day New Orleans by 1763. If you like this video, please feel free to share it and subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell if you want to receive notifications when we do more historic videos. I'm Jeff Dial, wishing you fair winds and following seas.